In this video, we're going to be talking about carbohydrates. And carbohydrates are kind of the enemy du jour when it comes to nutrition. And a lot of women, especially like let's say you're going through the grocery store line, you see some women's magazines, a lot of women believe because of this influence that carbs are the enemy. It is what is causing their blood sugar spikes, it's what is causing them to store fat, and it's responsible for everything from bloating to bad skin to bad hair. The ketogenic diet has become extremely popular and has really villainized carbohydrates. So the good news is it doesn't have to be that way. If you do like eating carbohydrates, the good news is you don't have to completely cut them out. And a really good, simple way to look at things, but it is overly simplistic, that's something we're going to talk about today, is the difference between good carbs and bad carbs. And you could also conceive of this as good calories, bad calories. We're not really going to get into that a whole lot. But what I'm appealing to at the moment is your common sense in terms of what should be part of your daily life. And obviously, you probably already know what some of the bad carbs are in terms of pasta, pizza, cake, cookies, etc. The things that you know if you get like a huge takeout from an Italian restaurant, it's pasta, that you're going to eat too much of it. So something that I want to talk about is today, diffusing some of those myths in terms of getting a little bit unsimplified around carbohydrates, but then making it simple to implement. So for example, we're going to talk about how even healthy carbohydrates can be overused and can hold you back. On the flip side, how to incorporate unhealthy carbohydrates into your lifestyle in a sensible way. And then third, understanding, for your goals, what proportion of your diet should come from carbohydrates to help keep you healthy and achieving your goals, both in terms of fat loss, aesthetics, and performance in the gym, in life. And we're also going to talk about hyperpalatability, which basically is like very tempting foods. Carbohydrates often play a role in hyperpalatability. And then we're also going to talk about insulin resistance, which is a big issue for a lot of women, especially at certain times in life. So let's start by talking about healthy carbs. So this is that good carbs concept, which it's simple. I like that it's simple. It's oversimplified, but the downside is that if you focus just on incorporating healthy carbs in your diet and that's your only tool for managing carbohydrates, you can still eat far too many grams of carbohydrates a day for your goals, and you are going to see it hold you back, even if you're eating very healthfully. So, healthy carbohydrates, I'm thinking, brown rice, amaranth, quinoa, millet, sweet potatoes, regular tomatoes, fruits, starchy vegetables, anything like that. If you eat too much of it, you'll be consuming more grams of carbohydrates per day than you need to fuel yourself. Your body is going to store extra calories. And notice I'm not saying carbohydrates. It's going to store extra calories as fat, and then that will hold you back probably from what you want to accomplish, probably. So whenever you're eating healthy carbohydrates, these whole food sources, the main thing I'm going to tell people is yes, focus on those carbs. Those are the good carbs you want to be eating. But the caveat is don't ignore measurement, because that is the downside to the oversimplification. When we just say, oh, there are good carbs and bad carbs. Yes, but the problem is when people do that, they often then don't observe their consumption or overconsumption of good carbohydrates. That doesn't mean that you're eating in irrational, binging manner healthy carbohydrates. You're not eating, a gallon of cooked lentils. But it might be that if you're having oatmeal for breakfast, sweet potato with lunch, dinner has rice and beans, and you had several fruit snacks throughout the day, it might not be right for your life to be eating that many carbohydrates, even though they're from whole food sources. It might not fit your life, your lifestyle, your goals. So measurement is very important. So how much of your diet should come from carbohydrates? In general, women who want to lose fat, and that is my main population. I do have athlete clients where fat loss is not the goal, performance is the goal. In those cases, I'm looking at an even higher level of calorie and carbohydrates. But let's say you want to lose weight, you want to lose fat. 40% tends to be pretty good for most people. And what I mean by that is your carbs are taking up 40% of your calories. So, let's say it's a 1,500 calorie diet. I'm just gonna spit out some numbers and you'll have to do your own math. But let's say you're on a 1,500 calorie diet to create a caloric deficit to lose weight. Because carbohydrates are 4 calories per gram, what that translates into is about 150 grams of carbohydrates a day. And those broad numbers, again, you have to do your own math, but those broad numbers work for a whole lot of women. I often see women successful when they're with fat loss, when their goal for carbohydrates is somewhere between 100 and 150 grams a day. Lower than 100, but not ketogenic, like under 40 grams, so between 40 and 100, I see women not performing as well, often. They might feel more lethargic, they don't feel as strong. That's not something I want for people, which is why unless you're gonna go whole hog ketogenic and you really believe in it, don't cut too low with carbohydrates. On the flip side, over 150, unless you are a really muscular, tall woman, and I mean you have a lot of lean body mass, let's say you have 150 pounds or more of lean body mass, which you would have to do that math to figure out with measurements and body fat percentage estimations, etc. Over 150 is probably not going to yield you fat loss. And that's a big probably, because it depends on the person. It depends on how much exercise you're doing. If someone's a quite serious athlete, they're exercising hours a day, every day, 150 is not going to be enough. But I'm talking about the average person. You exercise, but it's not your biggest priority in life. You're not exercising hours and hours every single day. Then 100 to 150 grams is probably going to be your sweet spot. And the easiest way to conceive of how does that number translate into real life, because it can be a really abstract number, is to think just like protein. We talked about doses. Carbohydrates tend to come in doses. So if you have the appropriate serving size of, let's say, rice, pasta, we're not even going to distinguish between, at this point, good and bad carbs. Let's just say any grain-based carbohydrate that you would normally eat with a meal, rice, pasta, quinoa, oatmeal, etc. They tend to be between 40 and 50 grams a dose. And that means per the normal serving size, which is usually about 3/4 of a cup to a cup cooked. It's typically 2 ounces or 1/4 of a cup uncooked, dry. So the water obviously volumizes it, so you have to really pay attention to those measurements. But it tends to be 40 to 50 grams per serving of carbohydrates. So that means that if your goal is 150, let's just say 50 as a round number per dose, that means you get 3 doses of carbohydrates to hit your goal. And the problem is we tend to discount good carbs, like I was talking about earlier. Oh, it's brown rice, it's fine. Brown rice with lentils, with organic cornbread, and suddenly you've got this really, maybe you're having 90 grams of carbohydrates in a meal. And again, if you just ran a marathon, that's great. But for someone who maybe has sat in the office all morning, you do not need that many carbohydrates, because think of carbohydrates partly as fuel. To fuel your level of activity, it needs to be an appropriate amount. And 50 or under per meal tends to be appropriate. And like I said, the more someone wants to focus on fat loss, cutting out carbohydrates cuts out calories as well, typically. So unless you're really making up for it in some other departments, but you might even want to get closer to 30 grams a meal, so that you're clocking in more at 120 grams a day. If you also want to have some fruit snacks or a bag of popcorn or something like that. So think of it in doses, and then think about how you want to plan your day. And the easiest way for someone to moderate carbohydrates in that way is either to think in those doses, or if you do want to be slightly more permissive with one meal, just cut the carbohydrates out of another meal. And the one that I often recommend is lunch. So unless you exercise right before lunch, or you exercise in the afternoon right before dinner, maybe lunch does need the carbohydrates, but I would say if you exercise in the morning or you exercise in the evening, make lunch your carbohydrate-free meal, low-carb meal. Have a salad with lean protein and olive oil and nuts, stuff like that. That's the easiest way to think about moderating your carbohydrate intake to hit that 100 to 150 gram goal per day. And of course, the caveat is if you're an intense, long duration exerciser, endurance exerciser, you're biking, skiing, or running hours a day, ignore everything I just said. You need a lot more carbohydrates. Okay, so let's talk about how to still include carbohydrates or bad carbohydrates in your diet. This is on a spectrum. You can't necessarily group pasta with a brownie because it's just not the same thing. Pasta, especially if you're having more of a whole grain type pasta, it's a superior nutritional food to having a brownie, to be totally honest. I'm talking about like the average brownie, which has sugar in it, etc. So we can't just lump them all together. The easiest way to incorporate what you might be tempted to cut out is to just do it in the right amounts. So for example, pasta. Have the right serving size of pasta with a meal, which is 3/4 of a cup to a cup cooked. Bread. A lot of people feel like they have to cut out bread. Have a sandwich, 2 slices of bread. It's not that much. It's not really going to hold you back. Where I see people get tripped up with these guilty foods, guilty pleasures, is more when they're consumed in, I don't even want to use the word irresponsible, very unmeasured ways. So for example, you're at an Italian restaurant, there's a bread basket, you order a pasta, maybe you have a slice of pizza from someone else, maybe some of the appetizers, like it's a crostini or something. That's where it really adds up and you're eating a lot of carbohydrates. And I often see people say they're going to swear off bread, and there's no reason to do that if what you're having is a sandwich or a piece of toast or an English muffin or something like that. It's not really that much. So start by focusing on where are simple, kind of controllable ways that you can incorporate something that maybe you thought you had to cut out, but it could be part of your diet. Maybe you don't need to cut it out, maybe. And then let's also talk about hyperpalatability, because to go back to the brownie example, this becomes very relevant. So think about foods that you have trouble stopping eating. And we'll get more into this in another video, but I like to talk about this in relation to carbohydrates because it's often kind of mislabeled. Hyperpalatability is when it's a very difficult food to stop eating. And it's usually a combination of salt, fat, and sugar. And the sugar, I could even say starch instead of sugar. So salt, fat, and sugar, or salt, fat, and starch. That combination with our physiology is extremely compelling for many reasons that I'll explain another time. And probably most of the foods on the list for you that you feel like are bad foods, you might think of them as carbs, but they may actually be hyperpalatable foods. So they have carbohydrates in them, they're starchy, but they also have a lot of fat and or a lot of salt. And usually these foods are also very calorie dense, meaning a little bit is a lot of calories. A donut, for example, not that you should never eat donuts, but a donut is a hyperpalatable food. It's starchy, it's sugary, it has a lot of fat in it, and it's often, like the salt and all of that as part of the flavoring. It's very hyperpalatable. Pizza, most pastas, the way they're prepared, etc. All these foods that we think of as guilty pleasure carbs, don't think of them as carbs. Think of them as like a hyper-palatable food. It's that combination that makes it so hard to quit eating. Because when you can embrace the idea of hyper-palatability, what you can do is let some foods, some carbs specifically, off the hook. So, the problem probably isn't a plain oatmeal in the morning with some fruit in it. That's probably not the problem. The problem is probably something that is a combination of salt, fat, and either starch or sugar, and is calorie dense. So look out for those foods. Don't group carbs in with that and make carbs the bad guy. Look out for hyperpalatable foods and how they play a role in your life, where they live in your house, how often you're eating them, how you interact with them, etc. And then finally, let's talk about insulin resistance, because not a medical professional, I always like to have that disclaimer, but insulin resistance is something that a lot of women have, especially as they get a little older. As women approach menopause, go through menopause and then post, again, unless we have someone who's super active, probably you're gonna deal with your body not processing blood sugar quite as well as it used to. And insulin resistance, without getting too much into it, the idea is that if you eat carbohydrates, starches, sugar, your body's just not gonna have the response to it in efficiency that it used to. So the common response is to go super, super, super low carb, especially around menopause. For a lot of women, that becomes really appealing because it feels like a shortcut and a miracle fix. You don't necessarily need to go that low carb. In fact, if you're dealing with insulin resistance, one of the first things I would look at, nutrition is very important, don't get me wrong, I would look at your exercise. Exercise actually improves insulin sensitivity dramatically. So you can really help yourself by getting far more active and really like lifting the intensity of some of your workouts. So maybe if you were exercising like an hour a few times a week, maybe you need to do an hour like 5 times a week. And of course, vary the intensity like we've talked about before. But exercise is gonna play a huge role in insulin resistance. So don't just look at food, also look at exercise. Do you need to increase the volume of your exercise overall? Do you need to increase the intensity, or both? And then with insulin resistance, the flip side is, yeah, you probably need to limit your starches more. And that's really, I would almost say by age that the youngest people are probably going to do the best with carbohydrates. And then it's kind of with each decade. It's not that I hate when people think of it this way. It's not like your metabolism just grinds to a halt. It really doesn't. It's just that it's a combination of you probably get a little less active as a part of like normal lifespan changes. Not to say it's great, like you should stay more active, but it's normal. And at the same time, your body's becoming less efficient in terms of using insulin to deal with your blood glucose. Your body might be becoming more resistant, especially if you've had maybe a slightly unhealthy eating lifestyle or a very unhealthy eating lifestyle for a long time. Your body kind of learns that, and it can be hard to get back out of that mode. So you both want to increase your exercise and really focus on getting that, again, moderating your carbohydrates, getting it within that container of about 100 to 150 calories. And this is a special note for insulin resistance, but I would say it for anyone, is really make sure to pair up carbs with protein and fat. So if you have insulin resistance, I actually would say, I wouldn't say this to everyone necessarily, don't just have an apple as a snack or a plum as a snack or a fruit bowl. It's healthy, but the blood sugar response you get from it may not be the best thing for you. Or another example is, don't just eat oatmeal for breakfast with some honey in it. That can really be a disaster for people with insulin resistance because it really does spike your blood sugar, even though it has a lot of fiber in it. So really think about combining foods. If you have oatmeal, also have an egg or 2. If you're having fruit as a snack, have it with a yogurt. So really focus on pairing things up because we want to blunt that blood sugar response so that it is more mitigated by the other macros you're taking in. And then, the big picture is, at the end of this discussion, is you have to, over time, start looking at the big picture too. You can implement little strategies. Like I said, maybe don't have carbs at lunch. Pair up protein with carbs whenever you have a snack or a meal. Don't have carb-only meals. Try to keep that between 100 and 150 grams. Increase your exercise. As you focus on each little nugget of a strategy, eventually, if you really want to keep going with it and see success, you're going to have to put it all together. So maybe that means tracking all of your calories and macros, maybe. Or maybe it means that you need to really look at a whole lifestyle change that might not be too dramatic. I tell people, don't make the ketogenic diet your first stop on the train. Try some other things along the way. But maybe like a paleo diet is a good intermediate step. And you can look that up for more details about what a paleo diet could look like for you. But the idea is that we really want to get the carbs in the right range. We want most of the carbohydrates to be good carbs. We want to reduce our intake of hyper-palatable foods, and we want to increase our exercise. And if you do that, you're really setting yourself up to be successful. So that's my talk on carbs. They're not the enemy. They can be your friend. They are fuel for life. They help you to feel good and energized and even mentally and emotionally good. but they should be handled responsibly to help you hit your goals. Have a great day.